in history from Harvard University. Nash's dissertation, The Conservative Intellectual Movement in America Since 1945, was quickly published and remains a seminal study on this topic. On the recommendation of William F. Buckley, the Hoover Presidential Library Association, now the Hoover Presidential Foundation, contracted with Dr. Nash to write a multi-volume biography of Herbert Hoover. The 3 volumes that resulted in the life of Herbert Hoover, the engineer, the humanitarian, and master of emergencies, remains the most thorough treatment of Hoover's life from birth to the end of his work in the Wilson administration as head of the Food Administration. He expertly edited Herbert Hoover's unpublished writings, Freedom Betrayed, Herbert Hoover's Secret History of the Second World War and Its Aftermath, and The Crusade Years, 1933 to 1955, Herbert Hoover's lost memoir of the New Deal era and its aftermath. As one of our archivists described George, he's someone who will forget more than I will ever know about Herbert Hoover. Dr. Nash is currently working on a study of Herbert Hoover and Franklin Roosevelt. His talk today is entitled The Great Enigma and the Great Engineer, the Political Relationship of Calvin Coolidge and Herbert Hoover.
Thank you, Tom, for that very gracious and generous introduction, and good morning, everyone. It is a pleasure to be in your company once again here at the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library. As most of you in this audience know, this was my research home for approximately 20 years, and it remains my research home away from home as I currently live in Massachusetts and continue to pursue various studies relating to the life of Herbert Hoover. And so thank you, Tom, and your staff, and the Jerry Flagle and the Hoover Presidential Library Foundation, and all others who've had a role in creating this conference and for inviting me to have the honor of appearing in it. In the spring of 1923, Calvin Coolidge had been Vice President of the United States for a little more than 2 years, but his hold on office was anything but sure. In the highest echelons of the Republican Party, speculation was rising that the laconic New Englander would not be renominated. Many Republican progressives in the West wanted him replaced on the ticket with Theodore Roosevelt Jr. Then, just 4 months later, before the dump Coolidge sentiment could crystallize, President Warren Harding unexpectedly died, catapulting Silent Cal into the White House. Acutely aware that he was an accidental president, Coolidge felt morally bound to carry on Harding's policies until the next election. This in turn meant that the new president would keep his predecessor's cabinet intact. Among the cabinet secretaries whom Coolidge thus retained was Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover. Since entering the cabinet in 1921, Hoover had rapidly established himself as one of the ablest and most energetic of Harding's advisors. "Hoover is the smartest gink I know," Harding had remarked one time to a friend. In the president's cabinet, only Secretary of State Charles Evans Hughes had wielded comparable influence. If the hard-driving Hoover and the genial Harding had been an unlikely political twosome, the pairing of Hoover and Calvin Coolidge was to be, if anything, stranger still. In 1895, each man had graduated from college. Coolidge from Amherst in Massachusetts, Hoover from Stanford University in California. From that point on, their careers could hardly have been more divergent. Hoover had become a highly successful globe-trotting mining engineer and financier with business interests on 6 continents. Coolidge had become a lawyer and politician in a small city less than 10 miles from his alma mater. During World War I and its tumultuous aftermath, Hoover, as you have heard, became a close associate of President Woodrow Wilson, a participant in the Paris Peace Conference, and an internationally acclaimed humanitarian responsible for saving tens of millions of lives from the threat of famine and death. Coolidge, in the same period, had quietly ascended what was called the escalator of elective office in Massachusetts, where he was elected governor in 1918. In 1912, Hoover had supported Theodore Roosevelt's Bull Moose campaign for the presidency, while Coolidge had stayed loyal to President Taft. In 1920, Hoover had initially declared himself an independent progressive before affirming a Republican affiliation and seeking that party's presidential nomination. During this same period, Coolidge had been a paragon of party regularity and, by 1920, a symbol of safety and conservatism. These distinctions in background and career experience were reinforced by profound differences in temperament. Hoover was a veritable workaholic, filling his calendar with appointments from morning till night. Coolidge had a much less robust constitution and was obliged to conserve his energy constantly. Not surprisingly, the two men's approaches to governance differed markedly. Coolidge's public speeches were often patriotic homilies, long on idealism and devoid of controversy. Secretary of Commerce Hoover's speeches tended to be policy statements, laden with statistics and proposals for action. Coolidge was legendarily cautious. "I have never been hurt, but what I have not said," he once declared. Secretary Hoover, though he too could be equally cautious, nevertheless generated an unending blizzard of speeches, congressional testimony, and press releases as he built his cabinet department into a bureaucratic dynamo. To Coolidge, the purpose of government was not to do good, but, as he put it, to prevent harm. When governments attempted to do good, he told a friend, they generally got themselves and other people into trouble. Hoover, by contrast, was an avid policy wonk and a trained engineer besides. And engineers are taught to alter their environment, not leave it alone. For the next 5.5 years after Coolidge's ascent to the presidency, the great enigma in the White House, as someone called Coolidge, and the great engineer, as many called Hoover, dominated the American political landscape. With all their disparities in outlook, some measure of friction between the two men was well nigh inevitable. Although some of the vagaries of their interaction are no doubt lost to history, the record is sufficient to disclose the basic pattern. Behind the facade of official etiquette and party regularity, one finds an evolving and increasingly tense relationship. Hoover's early contacts with Coolidge showed every sign of cordiality and cooperation. Indeed, in the first 1.5 years of Coolidge's tenure, he appeared to welcome Hoover's input and even added to Hoover's responsibilities. One area where they found common ground was agricultural policy, perhaps the most contentious issue for the Republican Party in the 1920s. As the post-war farm crisis lengthened, farmers and their congressional allies clamored for federal assistance, notably a massive interventionist proposal known as the McNary-Haugen Bill. Although no disciple of laissez-faire, Hoover vehemently opposed McNary-Haugenism, which he considered dangerously socialistic and thoroughly unsound. By the spring of 1924, an early version of the McNary-Haugen Bill was before Congress. With an eye probably on the coming election, President Coolidge refrained from definitive comment. But from the farm legislation that he did support in 1924, we can infer that his position on this issue was much closer to Hoover's than to the McNary-Haugenites. In the initial battle to defeat the McNary-Haugen specter, a bond was forged between Hoover and Coolidge. It was to be the most important and consequential bond of their relationship. In the early months of Coolidge's presidency, Hoover had another opportunity to cement his ties to his new chief. In November 1923, California's prickly progressive Republican Senator Hiram Johnson announced that he would seek the Republican presidential nomination in 1924. Johnson was already an arch-enemy of Hoover, who had challenged him in California's presidential primary in 1920. With Hoover's assistance and blessing, his California faction swung into action in behalf of Coolidge. And when the votes were counted in the 1924 California primary, Coolidge had administered a humiliating defeat to Johnson, thereby clearing the last hurdle to an easy nomination. More gratifying perhaps to Hoover, his well-organized supporters had secured his ascendancy over Johnson in the California Republican Party. And remember that California was Hoover's political home in that period. He was a resident at Stanford. And this ascendancy that he had secured was a decisive step in Hoover's own quest for the White House. As it happened, Herbert Hoover nearly became Calvin Coolidge's running mate in 1924. At the Republican National Convention, after abortive efforts to nominate two other men for vice president who said they weren't interested, Coolidge's campaign manager, William Butler, decreed that Hoover be chosen as Coolidge's running mate. It was too late. Throughout the convention, many party leaders had resented the tactless ways of Butler, and now, on the decisive ballot, they took their revenge. Furious at Butler, and many of them none too keen on Hoover anyway, the old guard stalwarts and other dissidents successfully nominated Charles G. Dawes to be Coolidge's running mate. There is no evidence that Butler, at the convention, had designated Hoover on any direct instructions from the White House. But it is unlikely that he would have tried if he had thought that President Coolidge would disapprove. In the ensuing presidential contest, Hoover actively campaigned for the Coolidge-Dawes ticket. A few days after the election, Coolidge asked Hoover to remain in the cabinet. The Secretary of Commerce eagerly accepted. On March 4th, 1925, Coolidge took the presidential oath of office for a new term. No longer Warren Harding's legatee, Silent Cal was now chief executive in his own right, and his priorities were not necessarily those of his Secretary of Commerce. Coolidge's prize goals were tax cutting, debt reduction, and economy and government, conservative goals. The cabinet officer on whom he most relied to implement these was Secretary of the Treasury Andrew Mellon. As the economic boom known as Coolidge prosperity took hold in the mid-1920s, Mellon's influence at the White House increased. This did not mean that Hoover's influence quickly waned. In size and reputation and governmental appropriation, the Department of Commerce continued to grow. Between 1921 and 28, in fact, it almost doubled its congressional appropriation. In many areas, such as regulation of radio and promotion of commercial aviation and many other fields, Hoover was in the forefront and remained in the forefront of governmental policy making. It was said of him that he was Secretary of Commerce and Undersecretary of every other department. In late 1925, the Washington correspondent of the New Republic observed, quote, "There is more Hoover in the administration than anyone else. Except in the newspapers and the political field, there is more Hoover in the administration than there is Coolidge." Temperamentally, of course, the gap between them persisted. And like many other people, the Secretary of Commerce found the president a little peculiar. Hoover never forgot the dinner that he and the chief executive had one night in the state dining room of the White House. Hanging in the distance under a light was a portrait of John Quincy Adams. Evidently, the reflection of the light on Adams's bald countenance distracted and irritated Coolidge. At the end of the meal, and without explanation, Coolidge ordered a servant to bring in a stepladder and rag. Coolidge took the rag to the fireplace, rubbed it in ashes, placed a stepladder under the Adams painting, climbed up, and rubbed ashes on Adams's shining head. No more glare. Without further ado, Coolidge returned to Hoover and simply said, "Good night." For all the evidence that the hyperactive Secretary of Commerce was a valued member of the Coolidge administration, in late 1925 and 1926, signs multiplied that Hoover was becoming disenchanted. One source of his anxiety was growing speculation in the stock market and real estate trends that were fueled, in his opinion, by the easy money policies of the Federal Reserve Board. Unwilling, because of his cabinet status, to intervene directly with the Fed, Hoover persuaded a close ally, Senator Irving Lenroot, to address a set of sharp inquiries to Federal Reserve officials in late 1925. It revealed Hoover in a characteristic role, the bureaucratic wire puller, working discreetly through willing intermediaries. Hoover himself, without mentioning the Fed by name, publicly criticized Wall Street's fever of speculation in his review of economic prospects for 1926. The developing bull market, however, drew no remonstrance from the White House. Hoover also believed that Coolidge was not being a sufficiently energetic leader in the ongoing struggle over farm relief. Despite these private reservations, Hoover continued to play the role of loyal lieutenant. As he did so during 1926, a number of newspaper correspondents began to refer to him as the economic president of the United States, to the apparent annoyance of the White House. The New York Times even published a glowing article acclaiming Hoover as a veritable one-man cabinet. Acutely aware that one misstep might sink his presidential ambitions, in the off-year election campaign of 1926, Hoover conspicuously assisted Republican candidates and publicly hailed President Coolidge's great work for national rehabilitation. By being such a good political soldier, Hoover probably hoped to allay conservative Republican doubts about his ideological purity and party regularity, doubts going back to his close association with Woodrow Wilson. Early in 1927, Hoover had another opportunity to help his president when Congress passed a new version of the McNary-Haugen Farm Relief Bill. Relying in part on ammunition supplied by the Commerce Secretary, Coolidge vetoed the offensive legislation. Behind the scenes, however, evidence was accumulating that the friendship of the president and his Secretary of Commerce had passed its peak. The primary source of friction appears to have been the issue of inland waterway development, an area in which Hoover was aggressively promoting a comprehensive national scheme entailing substantial federal involvement, to Coolidge's evident dismay. On one occasion, late in the 1926 election campaign, Coolidge curtly warned Hoover by telegram not to make any speeches on subjects that came under the jurisdiction of the Department of the Interior rather than the Department of Commerce. Hoover was taken aback and strenuously protested his innocence of any transgression, and the awkward moment soon passed. But the one-man cabinet now realized more than ever that if he was not careful, he could alienate his boss. Despite these and other mounting signs of presidential displeasure, in April 1927, Coolidge asked Hoover to help coordinate the federal government's response to a terrible flood raging along the Mississippi River, the worst natural disaster up to that point in American history. Hoover immediately took charge of the vast relief effort and won fresh national accolades as a humanitarian hero and master of emergencies. President Coolidge publicly commended his great service. For his part, Hoover seemed anxious that spring and summer to proclaim his public fealty to his employer in the White House. As speculation intensified about whether Coolidge would run for president again, Hoover let it be known that he himself was not a candidate and that he favored Coolidge for another term in office. On July 20th, 1927, Hoover arrived in the Black Hills of South Dakota, where he briefed the vacationing president about the Mississippi Valley's flood recovery needs. Coolidge may have feared that his ubiquitous Commerce Secretary would ask him to open the spigots of the federal treasury for flood relief and reconstruction. In any case, the atmosphere in South Dakota seems to have been anything but cordial. When Hoover stepped off the train, it was a Secret Service agent who met him. The president did not get out of his car. When Hoover came over to the waiting automobile, Coolidge greeted him without a smile. Later, the two men were chauffeured to the president's office in Rapid City. On the entire drive, 30 miles, neither man spoke to the other. Less than 2 weeks later, Hoover was vacationing in California when a telegram arrived from the Associated Press. It read, "President Coolidge issued statement as follows, quote, 'I do not choose to run for president in 1928, unquote. Please telephone or telegraph your views of President's statement.'" Suddenly, the path to the White House was open. Or was it? In reconstructing the next phase in the Coolidge-Hoover relationship, it may help to recall that Coolidge was both a stubborn Vermont Yankee and a lover of practical jokes. Certainly, this least flamboyant of presidents must have relished the perplexity that his cryptic announcement produced in the nation's political elite. What did the president mean, and how much did he mean it? For the next 10 months, Hoover and other politically attuned Americans struggled to divine the answer. Coolidge's stunning thunderbolt posed immediate problems for Hoover. Already under suspicion at the White House for his pushiness, the Secretary of Commerce could ill afford to look overtly ambitious, at least not until the president's own intentions were certain. If for Hoover the future still seemed murky, for Coolidge apparently it was altogether clear. Sometime in the autumn of 1927, the president was out on one of his frequent strolls in downtown Washington with his Secret Service escort and friend, Edmund W. Starling. Suddenly, Coolidge spoke. "Well, they're going to elect that Superman Hoover, and he's going to have some trouble. He's going to have to spend money, but he won't spend enough. Then the Democrats will come in, and they'll spend money like water. But they don't know anything about money. Then they will want me to come back and save some money for them. But I won't do it." If this anecdote recorded in Starling's memoirs is accurate, and there's no reason to doubt its essence, it was one of the most prescient remarks that Calvin Coolidge ever made. One area where Coolidge and Hoover were diverging was their attitude toward the surging stock market. By early 1928, prices on the New York Stock Exchange had advanced to record levels, abetted by a staggering growth in brokers' loans. On January 6th, President Coolidge was asked at a news conference whether the amount of these loans was now dangerously high. Relying upon information from the Treasury Department, the president replied that he saw no signs that the amount was large enough to cause particularly unfavorable comment. Upon hearing this presidential benediction, the stock market soared again. When Hoover, who had been trying for some time to induce the Federal Reserve Board to apply the brakes, heard this, he was incredulous. Turning to an aide, he asked, "Did Coolidge say that?" Actually, Coolidge himself had qualms about the enormous credit expansion that was driving the stock market upward, but for a variety of reasons he kept them private and declined to intervene. As he put it to a relative a few days later, "I regard myself as the representative of the government and not as an individual." When technical matters arose, he said, he turned them over to the appropriate government agency and used the resulting feedback as the basis for his official stance. That, however, he added, does not prevent me from thinking what I please as an individual. And as an individual, he considered any loan obtained for what he called gambling in stocks to be an excessive loan. Herbert Hoover's conception of the presidential office was to be far more expansive. Meanwhile, Coolidge's attitude toward Hoover was becoming more critical. In the wake of the Mississippi flood disaster and the shower of accolades heaped upon the Secretary of Commerce, Coolidge began privately to disparage Hoover as the miracle worker and wonder boy. Nonetheless, Coolidge posed no objections to Hoover's running for president when Hoover, on at least 2 occasions, went to the White House and tried to clarify Coolidge's desire. And Hoover made it plain that if Coolidge was still thinking of running, Hoover would step aside. But he got no clear answer on that, and finally, in February of 28, Hoover publicly affirmed his candidacy for the presidency. Publicly, Coolidge remained scrupulously neutral in the developing presidential campaign. Privately, however, an agitated Hoover was not so sure. Hoover was fully cognizant that much of the opposition to his candidacy was coming from conservative Republicans who were plotting for a deadlocked convention and then a last-minute draft of Coolidge. Furthermore, Hoover believed, as he later wrote a friend, that Coolidge considered him a somewhat dangerous liberal. From day to day, Hoover lived in fear that the enigmatic man in the White House would in some way intervene and deprive him of the great prize. Meanwhile, in Washington, the McNary-Haugen monster had once again reared its head. Only weeks before the Republican Convention of 1928, Congress enacted yet another version of this farm relief panacea so loathed by Coolidge and Hoover. On May 23rd, President Coolidge emphatically vetoed the measure. For Hoover, the president's scathing rebuff of McNary-Haugenism was a mixed blessing. On the one hand, it highlighted a critical issue on which he was in accord with Coolidge and with the conservative eastern wing of the Republican Party. It also threw a massive roadblock in front of Hoover's rivals for the nomination, some of whom, such as former Governor Frank Loudon of Illinois, had endorsed the legislation. On the other hand, the divisive controversy now threatened to sunder the Republican Party and ignite the defection of the Farm Belt states to the Democrats. In a bid to quell the threatened agrarian rebellion, Hoover's friend, Secretary of Agriculture William Jardine, asked the president in May to send a special message to Congress urging enactment of an alternative farm bill sponsored by Jardine and Hoover. In this way, the farm states could be appeased. But Coolidge was not to be moved. When Jardine asked him outright to send the special message as a favor to Hoover, the Republican frontrunner and presumptive nominee, the president exploded. "That man has offered me unsolicited advice for 6 years, all of it bad." The The final weeks before the convention were a time of high but covert drama, as pro- and anti-Hoover forces attempted to smoke out the Sphinx in the White House. Hoover's agony was excruciating. Despite tremendous pressures from conservative Republicans, Coolidge refused to give the signal that even them could have stopped Hoover. Yet if Coolidge did not interfere and did not want the nomination, he was not necessarily gratified by the convention's outcome. As it happened, the president was on his way by train to Wisconsin for a summer vacation when the Republican Party chose his successor. When Coolidge received the news of Hoover's victory, the Secret Service agent who was with him never forgot his reaction. His face betraying anger, the president bluntly ordered the agent to get him a bottle of whiskey. At this point, one might ask, if Coolidge was so unenthusiastic about Hoover, why did he not try in some way to thwart Hoover's pursuit of the prize? First, Coolidge appears to have sincerely believed that a sitting president should not, in most cases, attempt to influence the selection of his successor. A second, less abstract reason may also have intruded: the absence of acceptable first-class alternatives. Vice President Charles Dawes, for example, whom Coolidge detested, favored McNary Haugenism. Frank Loudon of Illinois, whom I mentioned, another formidable contender, also embraced the McNary-Haugen heresy. And there were some who think that if it hadn't been for that McNary-Haugen veto, Loudon might just have won the nomination over Hoover in the end. But that was the great roadblock. This dearth, then, of acceptable rivals of Hoover in 1928, acceptable, that is, to party conservatives, underscores the centrality of the McNary-Haugen controversy in Republican politics in the 1920s. On this, one of the key issues of the day, Hoover and Coolidge stood on the same side of the ideological divide. Without this essential common ground between them, it is doubtful that Hoover could have become Coolidge's successor. In the next several months, the now familiar Coolidge-Hoover pattern repeatedly manifested itself: public correctness, private strain. On July 16th, the Republican nominee and Mrs. Hoover visited the presidential retreat in the Wisconsin woods. At the outset, at least, it was an awkward encounter. When the two men met, the president was unsmiling. It was left to the two wives to do the smiling. A few minutes later, Coolidge and Hoover sat solemnly for the photographers. When asked by one of them to carry on a conversation, the president turned to Hoover and made some remark. Hoover smiled, but made no reply. The president spoke to him again. Once more his guest smiled, but said nothing. Turning to the photographers, Coolidge said, "I am sorry. I am willing, but I cannot get Mr. Hoover to keep up his end of the conversation." This was a switch. Silent Cal unable to get Hoover to speak. Mrs. Coolidge and Mrs. Hoover were greatly amused. Time does not permit a recitation of the excruciating process by which Hoover and his allies now struggled to secure Coolidge's enthusiastic endorsement of the ticket. Several times in the summer and fall, Coolidge issued words of public support, but never, it seemed, warmly enough or promptly enough to satisfy Republican activists. Nor did Coolidge accede to requests that he campaign for his party's nominee. The chief executive told visitors that he did not consider it dignified for a president to deliver speeches in a political campaign. But in the end, just 4 days before the election, Coolidge, ever the party regular, finally gave Hoover an extraordinarily effusive public endorsement in a prearranged telegram that evoked sensational newspaper headlines. Hoover, he declared, had shown his fitness to be president. Hoover said Coolidge was able, experienced, trustworthy, and safe. Hoover was grateful. Republican leaders were jubilant and relieved. And when Hoover won in a landslide, Coolidge hailed the result as an endorsement of his own administration and announced that he could now retire from office in contentment. The president's term, however, still had 4 months to run, and he was known to be very touchy about his prerogatives. No doubt with these sensitivities in mind, Hoover proposed that he, Hoover, take a semi-official goodwill tour of Latin America after the election. Coolidge agreed. And so, from November 19, 1928, until early January 1929, Hoover not only stayed out of Washington, better still, he stayed out of the country. On March 4th, 1929, fulfilling an ambition that had touched his soul for a decade or longer, Herbert Hoover became President of the United States. He had done so without ever having held an elective public office. For an hour and a half during the ceremonies, he and Calvin Coolidge stood, sat, and walked side by side without saying a word to each other. In his inaugural address, Hoover politely paid tribute to his predecessor. When the ceremonies at the Capitol were over, the two men said goodbye, and the ex-president took a train home to New England. Coolidge's exit from Washington did not mean that he had permanently left the national stage, however, much as he and Hoover may have desired it. For the next 4 years, as Coolidge prosperity curdled into depression, the puzzling Yankee up in Northampton, Massachusetts, cast a troubling shadow over his successor. As the Great Depression intensified, talk of replacing Hoover in 1932 with another candidate circulated widely among Republican leaders. Hoover could never be sure when a challenge to his renomination might erupt from party conservatives, or for that matter, from Republican progressives. Hoover knew painfully well that Coolidge could have taken the prize from him in 1928 at any time, and that the Coolidge faction had only grudgingly acquiesced in Hoover's selection. The man in the White House therefore kept an anxious eye on the former president in Northampton. Ever the worrier, Hoover was soon convinced that Coolidge was preparing to be a candidate for president again, or that someone close to Coolidge would challenge Hoover's bid for renomination. Publicly, of course, and by now we should not expect otherwise, the two men maintained a carefully respectful relationship. They even met on a couple of ceremonial occasions. If Coolidge had reservations about his successor's policies, he did not discuss them in public. Nor did Coolidge undercut the incumbent with any proposals of his own, despite incessant pleadings that he do so. As it happened, Hoover need not have fretted about Coolidge's political ambitions. Ever the party loyalist and burdened by failing health, the former president had no intention of running again. In the spring of 1932, he gave no encouragement when die-hard Coolidgeites attempted to draft him for the national ticket. Hoover and his allies easily quashed the abortive insurrection. In September, Coolidge told a friend that it would be a great calamity if Hoover were not reelected. In the fall campaign, despite an ailing throat, Coolidge made 2 forceful public speeches in behalf of his successor, and one of these was in Madison Square Garden. It was Coolidge's turn to be the loyal lieutenant. Coolidge's argument was a classically conservative case for a man he had once disparaged as a meddlesome liberal. Herbert Hoover was almost pathetically grateful. Only 2 months after the election, Calvin Coolidge died suddenly. Hoover was shocked and attended his funeral in Northampton. Perhaps partly in gratitude for Coolidge's valiant contribution to the Republican campaign in 1932 when his health was slipping, Hoover in the years to come tended to suppress the depth and detail of their past differences. To one correspondent in 1934, he even denied that there had ever been any friction between Coolidge and himself. The acute underlying sense of vexation that Hoover and Coolidge came to feel about each other was lacking in Hoover's later reminiscences. Long after his predecessor passed away, Hoover perpetuated the patina of diplomatic correctness that had marked their relationship in life. Personal factors may also have contributed to his self-restraint. During the 1920s, Coolidge's wife, Grace, and Hoover's wife, Lou, had become dear friends who corresponded for years. They eventually had nicknames for each other in the letters they exchanged. Mrs. Coolidge was known as Lily, or sometimes Easter Lily. Mrs. Hoover was Bleeding Heart. This, I believe, derived from their custom starting about 1928 of exchanging those plants on Easter Sunday. They did that for a number of years. Herbert Hoover, meanwhile, corresponded at times with Mrs. Coolidge on several occasions. In 1962, at the age of 88, he enthusiastically accepted the invitation of Coolidge's son, John, to join the advisory board of the new Calvin Coolidge Memorial Foundation, and urged him to establish a Coolidge Presidential Library. Thus did the norms of politeness prevail over full public disclosure of Hoover's often tense relationship with Calvin Coolidge. And what more need now be said? Political parties are alliances of factions. Only 3 times in the 20th century, 1908, 1928, and 1988, did an elected candidate of one party succeed in office an elected incumbent of the same party. Such intra-party successions can be fraught with peril, for they entail the ascendancy of a new faction within the coalition. Trouble can soon result over redistribution of patronage and much else. If Calvin Coolidge had been a younger man and less of an organization man, the Republican Party might have engaged in factional warfare in 1932, as it did in 1912 and 1992, and for some of the same reasons. The convoluted Coolidge-Hoover story also illustrates something else. The Republican Party in the 1920s was no monolith. In the nuances of these two men's relationship, we can see in microcosm some of the political fault lines in a decade far more intriguing than is usually perceived. Thank you.
Question?
My history isn't that good, but who were the presidents of those last 3 elections that you mentioned, 1992 and 2 others previous to that?
Yes, in 1908, this is when Taft succeeded Teddy Roosevelt. So it was the same party and so
Right,
forth.
okay.
And within 2 years, the Republican Party was in a civil war between the Taftites and the Roosevelt people. In 1928, Hoover, of course, was succeeding Coolidge, and Hoover was winning out over the considerable opposition of the Eastern conservative wing of the Republican Party that didn't trust him. In 1988, it was George Bush, the first George Bush, succeeding Ronald Reagan. And there were tensions that developed rather quickly between the Bush people and the residual Reaganites. And in 1992, that's one of the factors that permitted Clinton to win, and Coolidge became a one-term president, as did Hoover and as did Taft, for some other reasons, but the factional factor, I think, was important.
Thank you.
Thank
I wondered if you could talk about the Hoover-Coolidge view on foreign policy, especially toward Europe. I'm thinking of the American loans flowing into Germany in particular. Were they on the same page in your view on America's relationship to Europe?
Yes. Did everyone hear the question? The question is, what about the relationship between Hoover and Coolidge in terms of foreign policy, differences or similarities in foreign policy? This was a period when the United States was not in the League of Nations, but it was not a period in which we were truly isolationist, and as that term is sometimes used, because there were many informal relationships between American business, great banks like J.P. Morgan and so forth, loaning money partly to prop up Germany and help out in the rehabilitation of Europe. Hoover, as Secretary of Commerce, considered that aspect of our considerable economic interaction with Europe as part of his sphere of responsibility. And this ended up putting him at odds at times with the State Department and with the New York banking elite. Hoover argued that the U.S. government should oversee or basically give approval to major foreign loans that were going to all sorts of European countries, cities, governments, and so forth. Hoover said much of this could be spent on arms rather than on constructive, productive purposes for rehabilitation of those countries. Why should we, the American people, be permitting money to be loaned out in that way? Well, this set him at odds with the State Department to some degree. Hoover wanted more supervision than I think the State Department did. It also certainly set him at loggerheads with the Morgan partners, some of them, who felt that this was, and others, who felt that Hoover was the meddlesome bureaucrat now, interfering with private transactions, private economic activity. So Hoover there was, in a sense, more interventionist than either the financial sector, or maybe you could say the Coolidge administration wanted to be. Hoover, I think, for a time was hoping that Harding would somehow, as was indicated earlier, see his way to renegotiate the treaty, if you will, make a new deal under better terms with the Europeans in the aftermath of the First World War. But Hoover saw that was not likely to happen. Hoover was very global-minded. I don't have the sense that Coolidge was caring all that much, but Hoover put attachés of the Commerce Department in major embassies who were there to, of our embassies, who were there to collect data, statistics on how much coal was being produced in Germany, that sort of thing. Data that would be useful for the purposes of the government and of private business over here. That kind of activity put the attachés somewhat in competition with the State Department's attachés, and so there were turf wars. And Hoover was at loggerheads with Hughes in the first term, for example, and in fact Hoover often had conflicts with other departments of which he was the so-called undersecretary, and they sometimes resented what they saw as exceeding his sphere of proper responsibility. But part of Hoover's condition for taking the job in the first place with Harding, who was a very accommodating individual, I would say, was that commerce affects nearly everything. So Hoover had a very expansive understanding of the proper scope of his agency. And you have to understand now, in the context of the 20s, when Hoover started, the Commerce Department had only been in existence for about a dozen years. And his predecessor told him, well, all you really have to do is turn out the lighthouses or something and see that the fish are sleeping at night or whatever. In other words, there's basically nothing to do. Well, that wasn't Hoover's temperament, it wasn't his philosophy. And he rapidly transformed the Commerce Department to the point that he became, I would say, still by far the most active and influential Secretary of Commerce we've ever had. But that kind of expansion of his influence was not particularly, it wasn't easily in character with the kind of Coolidge program of debt reduction and so on. Hoover was also on the the Debt Commission for the renegotiation of debts by European countries, and he was particularly interested in Belgium's situation. My sense is that Hoover was not a believer in extracting every dime that the Allies owed us from all the war debts, which were something like $10 billion. Privately, he would have been willing to make some compromises. At one point, he said that some of this money should be used to set up cultural exchange educational funds for people, rather than just taking the money back. Coolidge's attitude was they hired the money, didn't they? And that may be apocryphal, but Coolidge's attitude was, all right, I think I'm fairly stating his position, that basically the Allies had borrowed this money, they should pay it back, and Uncle Sam is the lender and should receive what is properly due. Hoover, I think, might have been a little more flexible, but when Hoover became president, he found out that Congress was not in an internationalist mood and was not anxious to make too many rearrangements along these lines. And so he had to, I think, toward the end, publicly claim that he's not seeking to renegotiate the terms of the World War I debts more than he might have been put into a harder line stance than in his heart he believed, but he saw the political, political difficulties and had to, accommodate to that. So, in short, I would say that the Coolidge policy would have been, correct relationships. Hoover tended to look more in terms of economic growth and interaction. Hoover was also a believer in the tariff policy. That was Republican gospel in those days. Again, my sense from studying him is that privately he was probably more of a moderate tariff man, but again, as a non-politician entering a political field, I think he felt he had to tread carefully. And initially in his presidency, particularly in the first year or two, I think he was a little unsure of his footing and worried about the political types. I think he got more assertive toward the end.
George, Tom mentioned that you're working on a book on Hoover and Franklin Roosevelt. I'm going to shift gears a little, would you talk a little bit about Hoover and Franklin Roosevelt in the 1920s in particular?
All right.
Roosevelt's out of office and then, of course, emerges as a candidate for governor of New York and so forth.
Yes. All right, it is a book in progress. Thank you for mentioning it. I still have some to write on the personal and political encounter between Hoover and Roosevelt. Just to set the stage a little bit, Hoover and Roosevelt did have some cordial contacts during the war in the Wilson administration period. They weren't, I would say, bosom buddies, but on a number of occasions through a common friend they would get together for Sunday night, informal dinners, things like that. And the Roosevelts, both of them, Franklin and Eleanor, came to think very highly of Herbert Hoover in this period. And here's a little factoid that some of you may already know. In 1920, Franklin Roosevelt wanted Hoover to run to be the Democratic nomination as Hoover's successor, or as Wilson's successor. And he even wrote a letter to a mutual friend saying that, I wish we could make Hoover president, there could not be a better one. Famous line that historians like to quote, one of the ironies of our history. It didn't happen, although Roosevelt actually did become the running mate of the Democratic presidential nominee in 1920. One more point on that. I believe, and my research in my book I hope will demonstrate this, that Roosevelt, who was encouraging a Democratic pro-Hoover effort early in 1920, that Roosevelt hoped to be Hoover's running mate. And oddly enough, he did become the running mate, but not of Hoover. So at that point, their wartime association and its aftermath, which led to a cordial but not intimate friendship, didn't cease because they still had contacts on occasion, but they were going in politically different directions. Hoover had by then in the 20s become, no doubt about it, a Republican, and Roosevelt was a Democrat and was seeking to overcome polio and rehabilitate his career. In 1928, Hoover was running for president, and Roosevelt that year, somewhat against his own inclination, was kind of coerced almost into running for governor of New York to help the Democrats carry that pivotal state. This was when Hoover was running against L. Smith for president. Roosevelt won very narrowly, like 25,000 votes, while Hoover was carrying the state by over 100,000. So there was a lot of ticket splitting. Well, that established Roosevelt immediately in 29 as governor of the largest state with the most electoral votes in the country and a potential heir to the White House. Certain things happened, isn't time to go into all the details, but Roosevelt rather actively sought through correspondence as a loyal Democrat to get people to support L. Smith. And he wrote letters to businessmen saying that Al Smith would be friendlier to business than this bureaucratic meddler Herbert Hoover, my old friend. And this eventually got back to Hoover, who thought this was rather not a nice thing to say of one friend to another. So the seeds of the great split were sown in 28, and then a number of things kept happening thereafter, which dissolved the friendship. And there's much more to the story, but that perhaps will suffice for an answer to your question on the 1920s. So they were initially friendly. They became rivals, and of course, even before they became rivals, they sensed that they were rivals, and that made the relationship ultimately untenable.
Thank you, George. Let's thank George for his presentation.